All right, thanks very much for including me in the program. So I'll be talking about a very similar topic to Layan, but a project with a little more vintage. So we try to evaluate the implications of rolling out e-commerce trading into rural communities, and the focus is going to be China. In this room, I don't need a lot of motivation for this. The main motivation that we had in mind is that the number of people in China buying and selling products online has risen from close to zero in the 2000s to more than 750 million by 2020, and now I think it's it's close to 900. And the Chinese government has noticed this, especially that rapid growth has occurred almost entirely in cities, and then walking down the city hierarchy. And since around 2014. The government has made it a national priority to roll out e-commerce trading access to rural communities, and I'll be specific exactly which barriers they try to address with that. And then there's again, people in this room know this probably better than me. There's a lot of similar programs in many countries. Around the time that we were writing up this paper, UNCTAD created a whole new vertical for its policy, E-Trade for All. Which is a platform to roll out e-commerce to rural areas across many developing countries. What do these policies have in mind? So first of all, the motivation of these policies is a fascinating one, and the motivation in China clearly came from Taobao villages. So Taobao is the e-commerce arm of Alibaba, I think I checked, like in 2021, there were about 7,500 designated so-called Taobao villages. So these are villages that are clusters of production, and they usually specialize in pretty specific products, and then a range of products around. So these could be specialized tubes for your aquarium machinery. These could be, parts of ping pong rackets. And then these villages start with usually one successful seller that builds a whole, ecosystem around that. And then all of the trade is managed through the Taobao platform, which means logistics are arranged. So you have modern parcel pickup and delivery logistics. And these towns, have been transformed, and they have been transformed clearly with the role of e-commerce. There's very little question of what happened there, and if the success in these rural production hubs would have been possible without e-commerce. The answer, given the way that things are humming there, and it went from zero to something, the answer is clearly e-commerce had something to do with rural development in these growth poles. And then the question we try to ask in this paper is, just how representative is that, and how rare is that? And I'll be explicit how we do this. But the policy is clearly, to unlock market access to urban markets. So in e-commerce, urban markets can see your products. You're in some rural village, and there's all kinds of information and communication frictions to marketing your stuff to cities. E-commerce lowers these information and communication costs, and crucially, they support you with the logistics of finding urban buyers. So it was very much motivated by the production side, less emphasis on the consumption side, even though there's some descriptive evidence that a lot of especially middle income people in China have shifted their consumption on e-commerce in smaller cities. But at the time that we were writing this, and I think it's still true today, there was relatively little rigorous evidence. Layan's paper has made a significant step in that direction. So what we set out to do is to evaluate what is the impact on average household welfare in a place if you take a rural village and you connect it through e-commerce in a program that I'll describe. What are the channels? What are the distributional implications? The paper combines a randomized control trial that we roll out with the firm that worked with the government to connect villages in China. Where we do a careful data collection to try to, say what happens to people's cost of living, to their price index, to their consumption options, as well as to their incomes, entrepreneurship, labor supply, wages, all this stuff. And then we, have these data for 100 villages. But we also have the transaction database for 5 provinces for 12,000 of these villages, and we're going to use both of these data. So what is the, what does it mean in the Chinese context to bring e-commerce to villages? It's not roads and it's not the internet. So these are small places. I'm going to show you the average village size is 800 households. So these are small, remote, rural places, but they're already connected to the internet and they already have road links. So what are the barriers to e-commerce? It's very much related to the last mile. In particular, modern parcel delivery, pickup and delivery had just not been functional, which means that the private logistics providers had not solved the last mile issue. It's not worthwhile to them to serve a little hamlet of 800 households with high transportation costs away from the county center. So you could go online, you could go to the Taobao website, but you couldn't order or sell anything because it wasn't hooked up to the delivery system. The second potential hurdle identified by the company to increase, e-commerce trading in the countryside is that maybe, there's digital literacy issues, they're low, there's trust issues, you don't buy from somebody that you don't know, where you haven't seen the product. So maybe, rural villages are different from urban households and they need a little bit more on the interface with these technologies. So what did the program try to do? So they wanted to connect 100,000 villages to e-commerce, very much with these Taobao villages in mind. What did they do to address these two barriers? They built warehouses close to the center of the county's main economic hub, and they fully subsidized parcel delivery and pickup to these villages. So from a transportation perspective, it was as if through e-commerce you took that village in terms of transportation costs, and you put it into the urban center of that county. In addition, they built an e-commerce terminal in the village center, where there was somebody employed by the firm who assisted the local population to buy and sell, so explaining them how to search. And you could make payments in cash, and you could receive payments if you sold something in cash. So you didn't have to have mobile payments, you didn't have to have digital payments. That was to address the transactional barrier, okay? And then the stated objective was to provide the same e-commerce access to these villages as you had in the urban centers of these counties. So from a policy and theoretical perspective, that was an exciting setting. If you're a trade economist and you hear that you take a village and you put it into the urban center of the county in terms of e-commerce market access, that sounds like a meaningful shock to economic integration. And what was nice about this is that was independent of road connections or independent of internet connections. So we could really study what happens if you lower those barriers to e-commerce in terms of selling, like rural residents selling stuff as well as buying stuff. So what we do is to first write down how we're going to evaluate household welfare. We're going to have the experiment where we collect all those variables, where we have the causal identification, what happens to treated villages versus non-treated villages. And then we complement that with the administrative database where we can observe not just 100 terminals, but 12,000 of those things. So the experiment ran at the end of 2015 and then into 2016. So this is a while ago. What we managed to work with the firm with is as follows. So this was, and just a question on, let me go back one slide and just, how to think about this setting. Okay, so this is a private firm that works with the Chinese government, and both of these players have the incentive to really make this work, and they have these e-commerce villages in mind, right? So what we managed to convince the firm to do is to do what they would usually do, which is they take a survey of all the villages in a county once they roll into a county, and they pick the most promising village candidates, okay? Most promising village candidates, a lot of it has to do with the applicants that would run the local terminal, but they also take into account local business activity, the size of the village, and so forth. So what we convinced them to do for the ICT is to do what they usually do, okay? Come up with a list of eligible villages that they want to treat, connect to this program, and to slightly water that down. So pick the 5 runner-up villages, okay, that they usually would not have put on those lists. So we got them to give us a control group. So we would then extend the list county by county, okay? So 54 village candidates by county, and we would randomly pick 5 control villages, and then a bunch of treatment villages. All of those villages would get treated, okay? So that led to 60 treatment villages and 40 control villages in 8 counties in China. across 3 provinces. These are the little county bundles with those 432 village candidates in there. All of them got treated except for the controls that we managed to protect for a year. And then the RCT results are going to be 1 year out, so 12 calendar months later. We couldn't protect the control group beyond that. And then what I'm going to show you on the administrative data goes into 2.5 years after. Okay. This is how these villages look. They're small places in different provinces and look differently. This is how the warehouses look. So they build a warehouse and they fully subsidize the transport to and from those villages. You would get the same delivery settings. Each village has one of those parcels there for both things that are sold from the village as well as things that come into the village. This is one of those terminals where the packages would arrive or be shipped from. This is a happy local villager sitting in front of the terminal. There's a store manager sitting there, able to assist them. And then again, transactions can be made in cash or through the network. So what do we find? On the consumption side, we find that around 14% of the village population ever make a purchase on the terminal. And that already tells you that, whatever happens to that 14% on the consumption side, the rest of the village does not take up. And that's a year after with heavy advertisement behind it. Those 14% see meaningful changes in their outlays. 40% of their durable expenditure in the last 3 months goes onto e-commerce. 15% of all expenditure over the last months goes onto the platform, goes onto e-commerce. At the village level, if you take into account the other 85%, it's way more muted. So 1.2% of consumption at the village level goes onto the e-commerce terminal and 7% on durables. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and I'll show you some of that at the end, but it's entirely driven by villages that did not had pre-existing parcel delivery. So if you think of lifting 2 barriers, the program did 2 things in some villages. It gave you parcel delivery access, so you would now be serviced by UPS or by FedEx, and you weren't before, and it gave you the terminal. We have villages in the sample that already were connected to FedEx, not FedEx, but like the Chinese version of FedEx that works with this, that just got the terminal on top, and we had those that got both. And all of the results that I'm showing you are basically entirely driven by those that did not have pre-existing parcel delivery system. That is indicative that, that interface issue of like rural villages being very different from urban dwellers in terms of the interface. The terminal did not make the meaningful change. What really made the meaningful change is that you could now buy and sell things on e-commerce with the same delivery logistics that you had. So it was the logistical ones. Younger households take up more, richer households take up more, closer to the terminal take up more, and then that's all maybe intuitive. Relatively more so in more remote villages. Okay, so if you have less access to the township center, you're more likely to substitute into the e-commerce terminal. No evidence that education, like things we thought would matter for uptake, no evidence that those matter. So the cold water part of the paper is that we find absolutely no evidence that anything changes on entrepreneurship, incomes, labor supply, wages, anything that was hoped on the production side to start selling did not materialize. And then you may say, well, this is just a year, and maybe it takes a little longer, and I'll be able to corroborate this with a more representative store data. Okay, and then we also, had hypothesized that maybe something happens to incumbent stores. There's a pro-competitive effect on prices around you, or they add more varieties. We find a little bit of a treatment effect on additional varieties in local stores, but that's more tentative. But we find nothing on prices falling. So we did store price surveys before and after. We didn't see prices falling in villages that were treated versus those that were not treated. From the firm database, we're able to do a number of things. The first thing I can show you is like, we get our treatment villages again here after 12 months. Maybe there's an increasing trend in uptake on the consumption side. You see it basically kicks in 2 to 4 months after treatment, and then it stays flat in terms of number of monthly users, in terms of number of monthly transactions, in terms of the value of those transactions. You make high ticket purchases first, and then it slightly goes down. On the production side, you see a hopeful trend. These are the kilograms shipped out of these 12,000 terminals. The terminal comes in here, and then you see kilograms shipped out. But even if you apply the export price index for electronics from China to the rest of the world to those kilograms, and you assume that all of that is local value added, it's a tiny effect on local incomes. Okay, so there's nothing in these data that would suggest that you hook up a village to urban markets through e-commerce, that something magical is going to happen to exporting to the city. Okay. which which comes very close to Layan's point that that you may have to have additional interventions on trainings, on digital literacy, how to manage online ratings, how to be visible to buyers to make this happen. This was very much not expected by our implementing partner, the firm, who tried to push the production side and wanted rural sellers to start growing on the platform. That was the stated objective. You can put all these effects through. You can put all these effects through, a welfare formula, and what you would find is that for the cost of living reduction on the retail price index, if you take total retail consumption for the village as a whole, it's about a 1% reduction in the cost of living. For the users, it's around a 5% reduction in the cost of living. There's nothing on the income side, neither up or down. And in terms of heterogeneity, roughly 1% on average, you see this is percentiles of households' income per capita. So richer households gain more. If you are farther away from the terminal, you gain less. If the age of the primary earner is higher, it goes down, and then the distance to the nearest township center. So this is more remoteness, and this is less remoteness. And I'll end on this slide where we just say that, in this paper, we're not saying that something is not true about Taobao villages. I've been to them, and they are rural production hubs that thrive on e-commerce, and there's no question about it. It's just, if you take a program and you randomly drop e-commerce connections to a sample of villages that were selected by the firm to make this work, you see nil effects after 2.5 years. On the production side of shipping out, you see meaningful consumption side benefits, but to a small fraction of the rural population. And that's where we stand. And then, open, very exciting research questions are very much in the realm of Layan. How do we make this work? Thank you.